Hi everyone. So today we'll be looking at the genre of the Indian novel. Um, Firstly, we're looking at almost like the broad topic of South Asian novel as well, because um, most South Asian countries were affected by imperialism, and thus their literary forms were also developing with close relation to that change in the history. Right. So quite a short explanation of what is the Indian novel? What is the Indian English novel? We see novel as a form that is emerging in the 18th century in Britain. First, to look at um, the middle class realist tradition with novels like Pamela, then later mixing it up with the Victorians, so novels like Tessa the Derbies comes in. A little later, the English novel modernizes, and here, when it modernizes, it enters into new thoughts and ideas as we explore in novels like Miss Dalloway and James Joyce's Ulysses. So the modernist novel is like the transition from a realist to modernist is that when we realize. But during that transition or rather during that development of the novel in the English era, what we need to remember is it is also a time of imperialism. So what was happening outside of Britain was that imperialism was basically taking over countries through colonialism, and we see that their form of the novel is also influencing what happened here. So, for example, in the Indian novel, as Meenakshi Mukarjee says, it explores and emerges as a borrowed genre, deeply shaped by European origins, particularly the English novel, which developed alongside the rise of the bourgeoisie, industrialization, and new awareness of linear and secular time. This is quite important to remember. And we'll get to that. So in Europe, the novel grew, and so did ideas of individualism, social mobility, and the market-driven ethos of modernity, right? And Mukherjee cites English education and exposure to Western literature as one of the strongest influences of the novel in India. This, of course, we can actually expand on it a little bit to understand, okay, what were the forms of literature that actually existed in India? There were local forms of art, local forms of poetry, even local forms of prose, and which vernaculars basically mastered in those fields of art is something that you could explore in relation to this idea. However, all in all, when we realize, the Indian novel in the Indian context, the genre was fundamentally reworked because the Indian novel became a space of negotiation between tradition, modernity, orality, print, community, individual, all of this. So the Indian novel was starkly different to the British novel. And to Indianize that novel meant to reshape narrative forms, settings, characterizations to reflect indigenous experiences, hierarchies, temporality, and even integrating myth, regional history, collective identities, and so on. For instance, let's say, for example, in Narayan's novels, you see a bit of myth coming in, you see a little bit of folklore coming in. But in later novels, it's completely the Indian experience that you're experiencing. For example, a book like Samskar by Mukarjee, you see, sorry, Samskar by Anand, you see how the Indian perspective of the caste system was completely changed by imperialism, and we don't see an explicit figure of imperialism coming in the novel, but we at the same time see how that has indirectly affected the world, how governance has changed and how politics have changed, and all in all to completely affect their experience as, let's say, just human beings, as citizens of the country, citizens of the nation. All of these were very strong influences that came through imperialism. Now, Meenakshi Mukarjee also introduces us to two forms. She talks about Purana and Nutana. Purana in meaning old, and Nutana meaning new. She says Purana symbolizes tradition, continuity, collective memory, and it draws from epics, mythology, oral storytelling, community-based worldviews, and time is quite cyclical, and identity rooted in dharma, family, community, and so on. Whereas for Nutana, it's modernity, industrialization, colonial, post-colonial image. And it is associated with a rather linear time, social mobility, individuals as self-conscious historical subjects, and reflects value brought to by pre-capitalism. Then you have as an education, the rise of the bourgeoisie. So Nutana was quite a different genre approach. And in earlier Indian novels, we see both of these coming together, conflicting. An example novel here is The Guide by R.K. Narayan. Another example novel you could always see Untouchables by Mukarjee, wonderful, wonderful novel, which looks at both these ideas through the perspective of an untouchable, or a Dalit, as they call it, called Baka. So Baka sees how Baka is actually able to introduce us to the Purana and Nutana ideologies as himself, and it's quite an eye-opening account, because we don't see it as freshly as he sees it. So that is that. I also want to introduce you to Michael Gora, who says, okay, the European novel often presents itself as a political neutral. It is actually a form that is historically and ideologically charged. Gora's book is called After Empire, looks at the post-colonial writing traditions, and he looks at, whereas, Naipaul, people like Naipaul, looks at the controversial career maps of deep disorders spread by both imperialism and its passing. And then you see Rushdie, people like Rushdie coming in to demonstrate that those certain consequences of that disorder that Naipaul is talking about, such as migrancy and mimicry. Again, we see something very similar in Untouchables. We see this in The Guide by R.K. Narayan, and then Migrancy we see later in the rather Pakistani novel by The Reluctant Fundamentalists. You see a lot of, you understand how migrancy works also. And So this idea that Gora is presenting that a novel is often presented as a political or neutral is wrong, and he says that it's historical and ideological charge. You can always connect this very easily to the two novels, Jane Eyre and White Sargasso Sea, wherein Spivak talks about this quite deeply, and we see how um, the idea, the role of Jane Eyre becomes like her character is established through the death or through the pushing down of Antoinette, or as we know, Bertha in Jane Eyre. And we see how even in novels like Jane Eyre, the imperial power that is behind it is largely absent. You also see this in novels like Bleak House. It's largely absent in the story, but we know that is how the money is coming from the imperialist. Capitalism is, you know, is one of the most influencing parts of the novel. That is where the income is. That is where people leave to get income, to get experience. All of that is still there. So, yeah, that's a good example where you could see how the European world is actually very historically and ideologically charged. So, continuing on Gora's understanding of the after empire, it provides engaging, enlightening readings of post-colonial fiction, and also showing how imperialism helped shape even the British national identity, and how at the end of that empire, that identity must now be reconfigured. So this is also it becomes evident in post-colonial context, like in India, where the novel is necessarily entangled with political and cultural tensions. Another example here we could take actually like our Ian Forrester's account of India, in Passage to India and then later in Hills of Devi. He looks at, even as a British, he can't stay out of the government. He can't stay out of the politics because there's so much changing. And even in our Narayan's Malgudi stories, on the surface, it looks very apolitical, but their everyday concerns are always very entangled with political references, political interpretations, and the fictional setting of Malgudi itself reflects that layered reality of a colonial modernity, race, caste, tradition, and also the emerging Indian middle class. And Narayan reworks the European form into a distinctively Indian idiom. So it makes, they show how it's important that we understand, yes, why the Indian novel seems a borrowed from India. It is not just only because of the changes in form and the content, but also because of the different experiences they had and the difference in that experience. So that's a brief account on how the Indian novel emerged. And yeah.